There's no doubt that real estate investors are super keyed into what the Phoenix real estate market is doing right now. That's got a lot of those investors asking themselves, would this be a good time for me to sell one of my properties? If that sounds like you may then be asking yourself, well, what about selling one of my properties if I've got tenants in it? And the answer is absolutely, you can sell a real estate investment property that's got active tenants in it. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. My name is Joe Maggiore. I'm the owner and designated broker of Desert Dimensions Properties in Scottsdale, Arizona. We're a full-service real estate brokerage and property management company, so we deal with this pretty often. The good news is, in a market like this, selling a home, an investment property that's already got tenants in place can actually become a strength because there are so many other investors that are looking to get into the market, and there are owner-occupant buyers who are way more willing to consider that now than they have been in the past. So really, where it used to be a hindrance to have somebody that was, going to be in place for the next 6 months as a tenant, right now, not so much. So today, we're going to talk about the additional dynamics that are involved in selling a tenant-occupied property. If I had to boil it down to one main thing to consider, it is extra runway. Give yourself more time. Make sure that the process starts a little bit slower than it might with a traditional sale. So what does that mean? It means that you own the property, you want to sell the property, but you've got to be respectful of the fact that that property is someone else's home. So things like additional notice, just some extra time to make sure that the tenants are involved in the process and in the loop, that stuff becomes way more important right now, and really it will serve everyone's best interest if you really focus on that. We'll start with the planning. So you're going to do all of the same planning that you would do with any other transaction, meaning contact a realtor, get somebody to start researching prices, look at comps. If you've got recent photos of the home, that's a really great way to introduce your agent to the property without necessarily having to have a site visit yet. But go through and get all of your planning done, look at your numbers, really kind of assemble what that listing is going to look like. Once you've got your planning done, you know your list price, you know your time frame, really the most important step then is going to be some type of communication to your tenant. Personally, I always recommend to my investor clients that we reach out to the tenants via email. It gives a really good opportunity to convey lots of information, really without putting anybody on the spot or, putting tenants in a position where they feel like they have to respond right away. But I also really like to put in that email at least 2 or 3 times that I would love to jump on a call with them. Give them the opportunity to take it in and absorb, come up with some questions, and then we can kind of talk through what that process is. So I mentioned extra runway when you're getting ready to sell a tenant-occupied property. Really what that means is, in a typical transaction, we are talking about sometimes a gap as short as a couple of days between the decision to list for sale and the actual listing for sale. When we're dealing with a tenant-occupied property, that's usually more like a couple of weeks. And the reason is that it really gives us that opportunity to make sure that we've got that initial communication, but then time for follow-up communications with the tenants. Making sure that your tenants understand the process and are put at ease is the most important thing you can do here. Once you've had that opportunity to kind of communicate with your tenants, set the expectations, you're working through things like what are showings going to look like, how can you fit that around their schedule. It's at that point that then you really start to fall back into a more traditional listing where you're then getting ready to actually list the property. Photographs, sign, lockbox, etc. I cannot stress how important it is to have the right realtor when you're looking at selling a tenant-occupied property. An agent who has really had some opportunities to work within that dynamic before, specifically the dynamics of selling a home where it isn't the seller that's living there, that becomes extraordinarily important. Another point to keep in mind, make sure you're giving your tenants options. I cannot tell you how many times early on I presented tenants with the information that the house is getting ready to be listed for sale, only to get a response of, well, we'd be interested in buying it. Well, that's fantastic. A lot of times that can work out really well for everyone involved. Make sure you work that language somewhere into that communication so that if it's something that those tenants are willing to consider, you know that early on and you can possibly put something like that together. That's another thing we do quite often is basically handle scenarios where tenants end up buying the homes that they've been leasing from these investment owners. It really does work out very well for everyone. It's also very important to keep in mind, what are these tenants like? Have they been great tenants? Do they pay on time? Do they keep the home in good shape? If the answer to any of those is no, you may want to give some consideration to either waiting until their lease is up, giving them notice of non-renewal, and then listing for sale, or finding a way to incentivize them, offer them something that is really a benefit for them to move on to another property so that you can take the property back do some rehab work, and then get it ready for the market. Understanding that every scenario is going to be different and you're kind of working within different dynamics is really important here, especially when you're dealing with tenants. Now, I know I keep mentioning that every point that I'm making here is very important, but this really is an extraordinarily important point. It is very important that you understand your tenants' rights. So a lot of what I've talked about to this point is kind of the warm fuzzies and making sure that people feel good. It's really important to keep in mind that when you're dealing with tenants that are living in a property that you're selling, they have rights, legal rights, things that could be very bad for the seller and for you as the listing agent and other agents involved if you don't respect those rights. So it is extraordinarily important that you're working with somebody that not only understands this dynamic, like I mentioned, but really understands what are these dynamics coming from. So what are the laws that are in place regarding access? What happens if an agent shows up to show your tenant occupied property without permission? Making sure that proper notice is being given. Making sure that when you do go under a contract and ultimately you're working through an escrow, you've got tenant deposits and rent prorations that are being handled appropriately, because there are notices that are required and they're time sensitive. And if those things don't happen properly, there is a financial consequence to the owner, in this case, the seller. So understanding tenants' rights is extraordinarily important, not just because we want to make everybody feel good, because we do, but really because there are legal and financial consequences by not respecting those rights. Yaketa schmacketa. So yes, you absolutely can take advantage of this market and sell a tenant-occupied property. It can be done. It can be done in a way that works for everyone. Make sure that you're keeping in mind your tenants' rights, the consequences of not respecting those rights. Make sure that you're working with an agent that's very familiar with those dynamics as well. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You can give me a call at 480-270-5355. And don't forget to smash that subscribe button and like this video.